10 years ago tonight, the people of this country were told to go back to sleep and that the skies over cities like Ankara and Istanbul belong to someone else now. The fact is, they didn't listen. By morning, F-16s had buzzed Parliament, tanks were parked upon the Bosphorus Bridge as it was known back then, and over 250 people were dead. Not soldiers fighting other soldiers, but civilians standing in front of armor with nothing but their telephones and their flags. A president of a nation addressing their country through a smartphone held up to a television camera. Also, a parliament that kept sitting in even as it was being bombed. Now, the fact is that we've seen coups like this in this country before. 1960, 71, 1980, even 1996. And in each one, the public absorbed it, adjusted, and then moved on. But this one was different. This time, the streets didn't empty out. In fact, they filled up. And that single fact rewired everything that came afterwards. How the state sees its own institutions, how it sees its alliances, and frankly, how it sees the West. Tonight, we're at the foot of that infamous bridge, and as well as a location of a monument that's been erected to remember. And we're here to ask a very important question: where that night has left us 10 years on. Has the threat that drove tanks onto the bridge actually gone away? Did the world's democracies stand with this country, stand with Türkiye that night, or did some of them quietly hedge their bets? And what kind of country did this decade of upheaval actually build up? Those are the questions that we'll be asking. All right, let's meet the people helping us answer all that. First, we have Hüseyin Alptekin, a professor over at the National Defense University here in Istanbul, where he studies security, terrorism, and Türkiye's grand strategy. He's just published a book tracing the country's strategic thinking dating back all the way to 1919, and he marks 2016 as one of its true turning points. We'll see about that. We also have Zuhal Mert Uzuner, a professor of international relations over at Marmara University. She has spent her career studying Turkish foreign policy and how this country's relationships with its neighbors, with Europe, get made and then remade. We also have Klaus Jürgens, a political analyst and communications strategist based in London, a familiar voice on this television network, watching Türkiye story from inside European politics and European newsrooms. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Valeria Gianotta. She is an Italian academic and the director of the Türkiye Observatory at CESPI, the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. She's tracked in close detail how Western media has covered this country and how NATO actually thinks about Türkiye behind closed doors. All right, that is our panel. Let's get into it. Hüseyin Alptekin, I want to begin with you. You have mapped out Türkiye's strategic eras dating back for over a century. When you look at 2016, you have categorized it as a very important hinge point. How does that differ from 60, 71, 80, and 97?
For one thing, all these coup attempts, some they reached their goals, some they failed in the process. There are some commonalities between them. It is a violation of the political space by some bureaucratic actor. This is what unites them all. But for this most recent example of the coup attempt in 2016, there are many unique specialties of this coup attempt. For one thing, it wasn't from inside. I really think that there was a high degree of foreign infiltration in the process. And there are so many unique things about this most recent coup attempt in 2016. And it's really very hard to explain to some outsiders. They are very unique to the historical narrative, what happened in Turkey, because the organization behind the coup attempt that we call FETÖ, the Fethullahist terrorist organization, it is on the one hand is a terror organization, but it doesn't look like the others. It doesn't look like Daesh. It doesn't look like PKK. It is a very esoteric organization. with different layers of memberships, secrecy circles inside the organization, multiple channels of some front organizations, many masks that really inhibit to see the organization behind the curtain. But eventually, I think in 2016, on this night of July 15, I think we figured out, even the ones who kind of resisted to see the real picture, it became really undeniable that night. We all saw what's happening, what is this organization about. And in 2016, this is very sad news from one angle, because the roots of the organization partly was inside the country, this is very sad, but also some branches of the organization, they got their support from so-called Turkish allies, from the European countries, from Northern American countries, and over the past decade, there is still an unfinished business, there is still an going on, there is still a chase for this organization, because the people who tried to carry out that coup that night, the ones who could fly that night, they're still living freely in some Western countries, and I think this really radically changed how Türkiye saw, not all of them, but some Western so-called allies. And it really broke the relations, and we are still trying to mend those relations. It was 10 years ago, the governments changed, the policies changed, but there are still some unchanged facets of that process. It's an unfinished business, and still there are some stains in our relations with the West.
We'll get to how what that unfinished business is, and we'll get to a little deeper into Fethullah Gülen a little bit into our conversation. Zuhal, I want to bring you in. When Hussein was beginning his conversation, he said what happened on the 15th of July in 2016 was very special. It was very unique. From my perspective, the people actually who got onto the bridge behind you, they weren't soldiers, they weren't politicians. I'm wondering if you could maybe begin this conversation by explaining the relationship between that particular state and its citizens. I think that's what also makes it unique.
Yeah, surely, because that was a civilian resistance. First of all, we need to understand, and that shows also a kind of consciousness exists in public opinion about this the coup d'etat attempt. Actually, that was a big discussion in those days. It's what kind of coup d'etat attempt, because it's a very new form. So as Hussein explained very well, that organization was settled inside the state apparatus. But despite that, we observed especially the consciousness about the security and order in the state is also a business of civil society, was observed in the streets. So the civilian resistance there was tightly connected with the development of democracy consciousness in this country. So from this perspective, yes, but on the other side, what happened in this country cannot be observed very clearly outside of the country. As Hussein mentioned, that the understanding what happened in that night and during the night is very special, very unique for the other countries, for the regional countries, because in the same years, in that the 10 years period in 2010s, we observed several transformations in our geography, and in that process, the streets were very crowded, yes, but how much successful was the result of this, let's say, the uprising and resistance was different. So this resistance presented as a success story for the defending democracy, and from that perspective, it is very unique and very inspirational for the rest of our geography.
Okay, Klaus, one of the comments that Zuhal made was, we didn't know what type of coup this was. What is it? I mean, it was very different than what the country had previously had experienced. I want to sort of touch with you how the world watched this unique event unfold. Within the first 24 hours, within the first 48 hours, I'm wondering if you could sort of set us up in terms of how the Western political class and the Western media class was reacting to this.
Yes. Sorry, thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity. I know it was not the direct question, but sitting here, I want to pay my deep, heartfelt respect to all the martyrs and their families and all the injured people. I think this is a reason to reflect 10 years on And we are sitting here, I think, exactly to reflect. Now, coming to your question, I would fully agree with my previous speakers. What struck me most is the resilience of the Turkish people. My family is Turkish too. I'm half, 49% Turkish now. The Turkish nation spoke that night and said, we want to keep our democracy and no one can take it away from us anymore. Now this is a role model development from the perspective seen here from Türkiye. Now you mentioned the reactions 48 hours, 24 hours. Yes, I was very, very surprised about the absolute lukewarm response from most European, definitely European political quarters. I had this very, very cynical impression sometimes that some people were actually waiting what is going to happen, and some people would probably even say, well, maybe there will be a change in government. And I said, hey, what is going on? Don't you see that people have been killed? As you said, not only soldiers, but individuals who took to the street. It took quite some time. And one point I always make, you know me, I made this before. The first politician who actually really said what is going on was at the time the British Minister for European Affairs, Alan Duncan, now Sir Alan Duncan, who came 5 times to the Republic of Türkiye and said in no unmistaken terms that FETÖ has a terror background or has to be seen as a terror network. And most other European nations, bar Hungary, they were playing the waiting game. Oh, what is going on? Again, it's in far away Türkiye. We don't really care. Let them sort it out themselves. And I said, look, listen, if you want to teach the Turkish nation democracy, you have to defend democracy too. So I'm still absolutely shocked about the slow, half-hearted response from Western nations. I think we will come back to the point what has happened in the last 10 years. But the immediate aftermath was absolutely shocking. One positive point was the visit of the ambassadors to the bombed parliament. And here we have to note the Austrian ambassador, Dr. Klaus Wölfer, who then put it very clearly into the media by saying, look, this is a shocking terror attack. And still, it took almost ages that other European nations accepted this as it actually was. So here we have to make sure, why is this happening? Why was there not more support? And I can say this as the international observer. I thought some people were hoping something like in Egypt is going to happen. I once said almost jokingly, a colleague from CNN, Mr. Wiedemann, will book himself into a Taksim Square hotel. This was about the Gezi Park protests, and only look down and see hopefully the government would be toppled. And I said, look, listen, what is going on? How can you interfere in the affairs of an independent democratic nation? So lots of homework to still convince many of our European friends, lots of homework which still has to be done. I hope it can be done, which will bring us maybe to the second round of questions. Is FETÖ regrouping in Europe, and in which nations?
I'm going to ask Hussein that question in the second round, but obviously I want your European perspective from you. Valeria, let me turn to you. You study Western outlets very closely. I'm wondering if you could sort of maybe compare for me how the 15th of July 2016 was being framed internationally, and compare that to what was being experienced on the ground here.
Yes, thank you. Definitely there was a huge misperception of the events, and also a kind of chaotic interpretation of what was going on. Definitely in the West, without no distinction about countries, rather within European Union, and also back to Obama's United States in the time, there was kind of a cautious attitude that night, I mean, in the 15th of July 2016, in waiting and see how the situation will develop. as Clausus said, some of the observers, basically, they were waiting and they were, to some extent, even hoping that the Turkish government may fall down. And some other observers, they look and they watch the situation with the lenses of the coup attempt back to the past. So kind of the army will make it. But that was not the case, also because what happened that night, it was out of the chain of command. So not all the army was united. I mean, there were this kind of criminal gang orchestrating the event. The misperception went also related to the reaction of the Turkish government. There were people expecting President Erdogan escaping from the country. Indeed, in Rome, there were some journalists at the airport waiting for him and claiming that the Turkish plane would land very soon. So that was the general perception. And I would like to say that still nowadays, despite many efforts were invested by Turkey and the Turkish government in terms of public diplomacy events, and many knowledge has been widespread related to the so-called FETO terrorist organization, there is a kind of resistance in order to deeply understand what is this FETO movement is, because some of the members of the organization are living quietly in Europe and they're just carrying out their normal activity and they're portraying themselves as a member of philanthropic organizations. So basically they are campaigning against the current state of affairs and the current government in Turkey. All of these made a sort of, again, a misperception about the real state of the affair of that night. But even today, after 10 years, it happens to me as a coordinator of the observatory in Turkey to engage in very kind of vivid discussion with people that cannot really get what is the reality of this country. They cannot really understand the peculiarity of the FETO organization because maybe they are in touch with some of the members out in Italy or in other European countries and they resist to perceive them as a direct threat, as a terrorist organization.
Okay. Zuhal, let me turn to you. I mean, from Ankara's perspective, as someone who studies Turkish foreign policy professionally, we've heard Valeria said the approach was cautious. Klaus was saying it was a lukewarm response. How do you feel that the early hesitation from Western capitals was interpreted by Ankara?
For Ankara, this was a kind of, let's say, the negative approach. First of all, we need to put that as a negative because it's at the end a kind of hypocrisy. On one side, there is a discussion about democracy and the representation of people's will, but on the other side, we see the coup d'etat can be a kind of the solution of, let's say, in quotation for hesitations about Turkey's role or Turkey's policies in the region. And that's very strange and very conflictual inside. It's in let's say, in their own thinking. Why? Because when we look at Turkish foreign policy in those times, we can see the much more soft power-oriented approach, much more, let's say, the pro-European perspective exists. But there are some disagreements, especially about the region, about the Eastern Mediterranean as rising competition. And these disagreements were considered a kind of challenge. So the kind of change in the country could be a kind of political tool from their perspective. So that, let's say, tacit support, actually, that was a kind of tacit support for what happened in this country, was considered as a kind of security problem from the Ankara's perspective, because if there is not enough trust, so that's very problematic for the allies. So the alliance or any kind of cooperation, there is need for trust relationship. So from Ankara's perspective, that changed a lot of things and search for alternative alliances, not like, I mean, the changing dramatic shift from the Western oriented perspective, but that it was obvious for Ankara that there is need for autonomous perspective, there is need for search for their own, let's say, its own security considerations. I mean, the guaranteeing security threats, somehow finding own solutions were prioritized prioritized by the Ankara. So that's why we can argue that this, let's say, the coup d'etat attempt and the lack of reaction, proper reaction coming from the allies and from the West, from European Union, is considered as a very important, let's say, erosion in trust.
Okay. Thank you for that. So let me come back to you. And you kind of alluded to this in your first answer, and it's perhaps a question that a lot of people, not only here in this audience, but also around the world that's watching this program, most want answered. The fact is that Fethullah Gülen is gone. You study these types of networks. What is your honest opinion in terms of their capability? Has it been degraded? Is it no longer there?
I can't say, unfortunately, it is no longer there. It is still there, but the good part is it's not here anymore. So this is very important. This is the bright side of the story. The organization had a very tight network of front organization. Some are operating on the education sector, some of them are in the finance sector, even under the face of charities. So they were pretty much everywhere in the state bureaucracy, in the civil society organization, here in Turkey, and also they had this vast network of schools, a global education project. And based on some independent reports, their number of schools operating around the world, they reached up to 1,000. That was the picture when we go back to July 15, 2016. But they lost their ground to a great level. They lost pretty much all their organizational network within Turkey. So this is a very, very important achievement from the Turkish side. But beyond the Turkish boundaries, they still have some mechanisms through which they can operate. And one of them is their education institutions. They are the front organizations, and many of them around the world, they were transferred back to the Turkish organizations. But even in the United States, they are still running, as of today, charter schools. Even in some Western European countries, they are still operating behind the mask of think tank organizations, research institutions. They are not very crowded in that sense. They don't have a great deal of muscle. But still they have some area where they can maneuver around Turkey. And they have this, very shady, very dark stories about Turkey. And they release some reports and you check where does it come from? Which portray Turkey, doing some dirty stuff somewhere around the world, and you don't see any name any signature under the report. When you trace back that report, it goes back to this, some think tank organization nobody heard about, and beyond the picture, you see a FETÖ person behind the organization. But I think there is a great deal of success in Turkey's operations against FETÖ. Pretty much almost 100% success within Turkey, a great deal of success beyond the Turkish borders, because Turkey's real allies, they helped Turkey a lot to deal with this organization. There is still something going on. I can't say there is nothing left of FETÖ, but they are much weaker 10 years after that incident.
Klaus, you maybe want to follow up on what Hussein was saying in terms of the Fethullah Gülen, the FETÖ network?
Yes, I would agree, and I think this is when we say take the rough with the smooth, this is the positive dimension. I don't want to make the parallel now to the PKK, but that would be another event. But I think within Turkey, luckily, FETÖ has basically ceased its existence. And I would come back to what happened 10 years ago, because the Turkish people wanted it to cease its existence. But I do see a danger, we have to be honest. They seem to have started regrouping in a number of European countries. I mentioned Belgium, Sweden and Germany, of course, to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, for example, the United Kingdom. And this is in part due to a number of Western European governments easily giving visas or residence permits to known FETÖ members, as if they don't care what they did before. So this is homework for the European governments. My real worry is that why would a terror network ever regroup abroad? What is the actual aim? To mess up the countries which give them basically a safe haven, or to prepare one day to return to their former homeland and create anarchy and chaos again? This is a question I think about a lot, and I have no answer. Some people say once a terrorist, always a terrorist. Some say you can reintegrate terrorists into society. The Danish tried. Apparently it did not work. So the Turkish side, I think with all my modest insight, the Turkish side should continue to lobby European governments to take FETÖ as what it is, a terror organization, dismantle philanthropic organizations, organizations, for example, in Germany, they're called Mutlu, like Frohsinn, receiving grants from the German government. It was only some years ago, a big newspaper article came out, Süddeutsche Zeitung, for the first time they actually mentioned what is going on in these so-called lighthouse schools in Germany. The German media initially did not really take it seriously, but last point, why do I see light at the end of the tunnel? Only 2 years ago, the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution said we are 14,500 potential PKK members or supporters on German soil, up to 1,200 of them with a latent violence potential. Now, if one country is waking up to say PKK is what it is, a terror network, it would be high time to say the remaining FETÖ members hiding in Europe are part of a terror network too. That's why I say there might be light at the end of the tunnel, but in 10 years it hasn't really changed that much. I hope within the next, if I say in the next 10 years, you would say it's far too long. Yeah. How can this be achieved? Can it be media? Can it be push from the Turkish side? Can it be civil society? What has happened here? The people have woken up and said, no, we don't want any coup anymore. We don't want any terror. We want democracy. The European side must understand once you harbor a known terrorist group on your own soil, one day they might just turn against yourself.
Klaus, you said that not much has changed in the last 10 years. Okay, I'll give you that. But what has changed a lot is what's happening in this country. We have transitioned into an executive presidential system. There has been massive rehaul of the state apparatus, whether you look at it from a security perspective, an intelligence perspective. So how, do you feel that this has made the country more resilient?
Yeah, actually that was the target after this, let's say, coup d'etat attempt. What happened in the country was much more focusing on some settled problem, like, you know, the role of military in Turkish politics was always so problematic. So what is the civil-military relations much more settled in a best way. We observed actually just after the coup d'etat attempt in Syria during this Euphrates Shield operation and other operations. So that was a security perspective. And when we look at the other perspectives in diplomatic aspect, it was another the process. And also in foreign policy perspective, we can see some changes, especially in Libya and other places. You can see some dramatic structural changes happened. Actually, we can categorize many different, let's say, the structural changes just after that. But what is the focal point of all these changes and transformation was much more related with creating a kind of stable inner order, and somehow it must reflect the stable and much powerful, much self-relying, much autonomous behavior to secure interests of Turkey.
You said, actually, I want to ask you to follow up on that same question in terms of Turkey's resilience, all the reforms that have been done as a result of that fateful night in 2016. What type of nation is this country?
So every nation, they need a form of story about who they are, about their position in history, about their national will. So such a narrative, such a story comes from some big real-life events. It might be a huge calamity, it might be another important heroic event. And I think for this century, Turkey got its founding narrative, the founding story, from this incident of July 15. I think it kind of manifested and almost embodied what we mean with the national will, the public spirit or patriotism. So all those high valued terms, concepts, usually we discuss them as if they are very abstract things. But I think they became really tangible, very concrete, very, very visible on the night of July 15. So I think it's affected not only our institutional structures in the form of executive presidential system, not only in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of a more self-relying, more autonomous foreign policy search, but also about our self-perspective, about how we understand our mission in history, how we define our nation, and how we find solidarity for this nation, and what we mean with patriotism. So I think maybe it is still too soon to really understand that effect. But I think from a broader perspective, July 15 became a very important, monumental event. And when historians, I don't know, maybe decades from now, when they look back the Turkish history and the turning points in terms of institutional structure, in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of the definition of the nationhood itself, this will become a very important turning point.
Okay. Valeria, I want to pose to you the last question before we turn to our audience members. When you look at European capitals today, do you feel that there is still some sort of skepticism that's whirling in the air in terms of the country's trajectory and what just Hussein was just saying in terms of the founding narrative?
Actually, just by wrapping up of what my colleague said, I do believe that the 15th of July has marked an incredible turning point, domestically, but also in terms of regional policy of Turkey. Definitely, we spoke about strategic autonomy, internal narrative, but what I see as the most significant element is that Turkey, staunchly from that point, invested a lot in its own self-sufficiency, and it became, after 10 years, a security provider at global level, but also if we look at the relations between the European countries, as NATO summit is already here. I mean, we see that actually many of the European countries have still important and strategic partnership with Turkey. So the perception of Turkey has changed in this sense. So by sealing also many complementarities and many new partnerships, despite the perception of veto or what Turkey perceives as its own threat. So basically, Turkey has been erasing as one of the most credible partners to some of the European Union states. For example, for Italy, the relations that Italy has been built over years has been one of the unique relations within the European Union realm, culminated with the Bayraktar and Leonardo joint venture. So in this sense, I would say that the perception and also the nature of and the state of the relations has changed.
All right, Valeria, thank you very much. Have we come to terms with the attempted coup, or have we asked the question, what would have happened if it was successful? Maybe that could be a follow-up question.
Yeah, so I think July 15, on the one hand, specifically for FETÖ, showed us, I mean, for some of us who already knew about the organization, it was a threat, it was a terrorist organization, there was nothing new for us perhaps. But there were others with good intentions, they did not believe that such an infiltration might be realistic. They thought that such a threat might be exaggerated by some others. But that night, everybody saw the organization in its full scale. So from that regard, by showing the threat, I think it's really helped us understand, and for the future, to try harder what to do against such possible threats. And I think the threat within Turkey, I think Turkey pretty much successfully dealt with this threat. as Klaus earlier said, it's not a finished business. There's still, some regrouping efforts by the organization. So as long as the organization exists, of course, the social reaction and also the state reaction, it will go on to contain and to prevent any further threats from the organization. But the follow-up question that you just directed to me, it's a huge mystery. So what would happen if they had succeeded that night? So who would lead the country the next day? Unfortunately, we know very little about that. And this is what the organization does best. They are really master of secrecy. There is no way to transparently see their goal for the next day. But what we know, they will change the government, they will change Turkish foreign policy orientation, and they will restructure the social cement in the country. But I really doubt they would succeed that goal. I think what would follow after the coup d'etat, I think there will be ongoing clashes inside the country. If there is no state apparatus standing against them, the society, the people, I think they would struggle to dismantle the organization. I think we would go on with some chaos for the, maybe next days, maybe weeks, maybe for more. So it is a very dark scenario that we are really very happy that it did not happen. But their list of policies, their list of figures to take over the government the next day, up to today, it is not revealed in a full disclosure. And unfortunately, many people who could fled from the scene, they found refuge in some countries like United States. And despite Turkey's endless calls for extradition, there was no positive reaction. Even the cult leader, the organization's leader, Fethullah Gülen, he wasn't returned to Turkey despite our endless calls.
Wow.
And he died in the United States, and they took their secrets with them. So some part of the story we know, we have some projections, but there are still some dark corners there in the story.
What do you want his generation to know about what happened on July the 15th, 2016? What should they be taking?
From my perspective, it was something seems like domestic, but on the other side, there are a lot of international dimension of that. Maybe it's important to know this dimension because if we remember those days, there was a lot of discussion about the probable inner clashes. So the kind of civil strife could be provoked very easily in those days after this, let's say, the coup d'etat attempt. So if it would be successful or somehow coming closer to be successful. But what is important to know that how successful thing is this. What happened that night is very important for domestic order, for international position of Turkey, for Turkish foreign policy, because when you look at those days, again, that I can remember a few discussions at that night, what happened in Cyprus, what happened in Syrian border, what happened in the western borders. On different borders, you can see different groups started to be much more activated. So that shows something very important from where we turn back. So it was a very dangerous turning point. So from now, maybe I can say that remembering how important thing is the united nation, being a united nation, to be conscious against any kind of the threats, because for your generation, what's very important for you is disinformation, misinformation, and somehow following the news in a correct way. So maybe this national consciousness and acting in a unity is very important for security and order for any nation. Yeah.
Klaus, at the beginning of our program, you said that you were 49% Turkish. So from that 49%, what do you want the next generation to really understand about this?
Well, what I think, some of you may know, for many years I represented youth and students movements in Brussels, in Belgium, all over Europe. And what always struck me is when the younger generation actually helps to take matters of their own country into their own hands, the country will simply be made better. But in order to do this, you have to be convinced that it makes sense. So beginning of this new millennium, there was this process, and I'm always very modest in saying this. I was not born in Turkey, so, and I don't want to leave the impression that I know everything, of course not. But what struck me the most, Turkey embarked on a course to first establish democracy and then a better economy, or the other way round. And the terrorists did not like that. They were afraid of a successful, modern, economically stable democracy. Some European countries too, patting Turkey on the shoulder and say, we don't care. I think in the last 10 years, you, as the younger generation, have become so much more aware about the value of democracy and that no one should ever take it away from you again. And you are part of a very successful country. I wrote some articles about this in the past couple of years, citing Ibrahim Kalin, who coined this term 360 degrees foreign policy. Now, you as a young generation should be really proud that Turkey is seen as a global actor, successful actor, and you benefit from it. There are still some pockets in society who might not agree and want to take it away from you again. Just don't let this happen.
Okay. Valeri, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yes, actually, that night I used to live in Ankara, so I witnessed with my eyes what was going on in the street. And what I take and what I would like also to transfer to all of you is the sense of pride of being Turk and the sense of solidarity in defending your own values and your sense of loyalty to the nation and to the Turkish flag. And also I was pretty much impressed because in the night, of course, the fight was going on in the street in Ankara, in Istanbul. In Ankara, they kept bombing until 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. But then regularly, every night, I remember that the main squares of the city were crowded by people, like celebrating the fact that the threat, the enemy was defeated. And also the combination of traditional values, as we saw that night, like the muezzin calling from the mosque to ask the people to go down to the street in order to defend the democracy. And the combination of the new technology, I think it's something that, if used in a good way, is something that you have to take as an asset of your own sense of unity and solidarity, by not taking as granted that the pride that you have in this country. Because really, if you look at some Western countries, we lost this sense of respect for the nation, the sense of nationalism that we have. So this is what I would like to give you as an insight.
What if the 15th of July 2016 was successful? What if?
Actually, we try to explain
Yeah.
a little bit, but if it's necessary to go into a little bit more, actually, that was much more risky for the country, especially for the civil strife, for my perspective, because what is success? First, we need to explain. If we think a kind of success, not to throw away this, let's say, the situation in one night. If it continues a few nights, maybe it could trigger a kind of civil strife inside the country, and it could create some negative, let's say, the initiatives in Cyprus, especially in the in between northern and southern Cyprus. There maybe we could observe some attacks. So that this could be referred, but the most important thing is what I have in my mind about this success. It could not be a continuous success in my mind, because despite this maybe a little bit longer fight against this initiative, at the end it could be successful again, because when you look at inside this event, the people inside the army, people inside different, let's say, the sects of society were fighting against that. So against the power of people, nothing can stay there. At the end, this organization was a kind of let's say, kind of secret network. So this can be always much less than the crowds of society. So at the end, it would be, I think, unsuccessful. So I can't imagine a kind of success story and constructing the government for this movement.
You say, do you feel that there, talk to me about some of the safeguards that have been put in place that makes July the 15th, 2016, very unlikely to happen again. I mean, Zuhad was talking about the power of the people, but do you feel that there's a safeguard that's been put in place that makes it unlikely?
I will be even more frank. I think it's impossible from
Okay.
now on, even more than unlikely. So there was this chain of coup d'etats in Turkey, unfortunately, starting from 1960. But up until July 15, actually we didn't have a really true sense of what it means with coup d'etat. So for that night, we just saw, all of us saw where it can lead to when the army moves against the elected government. What might happen? Because the previous coup d'etats, they were relatively smooth. They happened and we really didn't know much about them, and when people woke up the next morning, they heard about the news. But this time we saw it with our eyes. And just seeing and even imagining, some of us are very young here, I guess, just imagining, the air jets, the tanks which were bought with the tax money collected from the people of this country, firing against the people of this country. And that is one of the darkest moments of our history. And now I think we have this full sense of where a coup d'etat can take us. We can see down the road. And I think that experience, I think it is the greatest measure against another future coup attempt. But of course this is just about the public perception of coup d'etat. But with the domestic reformation of institutional politics, a lot changed. The structure of the army changed, the military education changed a lot. Now we have this National Defense University network, which doesn't only teach soldiers how to fight, but also teaches them how to be really careful about such attempts by some dark organizations. So I think not only the soldiers, not only the politicians, but the nation as a whole, now we know what a real coup d'etat might lead to. I think this is the greatest measure against another attempt.
Okay. Being able to see down the rabbit hole, it's a huge asset when you think about it. I think 10 years on, Klaus, do you feel that Western capitals, about the institutional changes, some of the massive reforms that Hussein was talking about, has it caught up with the reality of today, or are they still stuck in the perception of 2016?
Well, it's a good question. I would need to have a crystal ball here, Alican Bey. But as I've said, I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, but a very dim light, not as bright as this one here. The perception in some circles, unfortunately, is still we only have to pat Turkey on the shoulder. We give them a couple of $billion to help with the migrant crisis, and Ankara will shut up and everything is perfect. But I think it was actually on one of our programs together where I said, Turkey, the kid no more. What do I mean by this? Turkey is by now so self-confident that even if Western capitals simply shrug it all off, I'm not saying that Ankara doesn't care, of course it cares, but it now has the stamina, the willpower, the success story to actually say, okay, then we choose with which European capitals we cooperate more closely. Might it be defense, might it be tourism, might it be education, what have you, might it be diplomacy. So Turkey is now in a position almost to choose its preferred partners. This was not reality in early in the new millennium. So yes, step by step, European countries are catching up. Unfortunately, via a number of very sad events. We can talk about Ukraine, we can talk about the migrant crisis. European realized Turkey is in a strong geopolitical position. So it's the combination. I said in Istanbul recently, you have hard power, you have soft power, and I would say Turkey has smart power.
Okay. Thank you, Klaus. Valeria, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of wrapping everything up. Zooming out, where is Turkey right now?
Well, in this kind of turmoiled environment, Turkey also, thanks to the ability to cope with the domestic crisis and to the regional challenges, stands as a highland of stability in a very turmoiled environment. And this has much to do, actually, with the efforts to fight FETO, to fight the other terrorist organizations within the countries, and to cope with the challenges coming from the region as well. When it comes to European Union, I will add just some small word about the European Union. Actually, the approach has been changed. We see Turkey on the other side is in the position to choose the partner to work with, because it has the capability, the soft power, and the vision that European Union has totally lost. However, when we look at the political side of European Union, like the statement coming from the European Parliament, still we can notice that they refrain to understand the reality of the domestic threats of Turkey and to FETO as well. So we are in this kind of ambivalent position right now.
Okay, Valeria, thank you very much for that. All right. The fact of the matter is 10 years is long enough to build a museum, but not long enough to make a night like this feel like history. For a lot of the people here up on stage in the audience, it is still a memory with a strong pulse. Tonight isn't really about looking back at what was stopped. It's actually about asking what was started. It is a different Türkiye, more sure of its own institutions, more wary of its allies' silence. So, from the July 15th Museum, that is our program. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us, Valeria, Klaus, Zuhal, and Hussein, of course. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And thank you to our audience for watching us. Thank you, and good night.